Welcome to day 3 of the NAMM show. I'm Dave Kersner. I'm here with IK Multimedia and multi-Grammy award winning mastering engineers Gavin, Lurssen, and Reuben Cohen. So we're going to talk about mastering and also the product that Lurssen Mastering has done in cooperation with IK Multimedia called Lurssen Mastering Console, which I have here. And this is an application that runs standalone on the Mac and PC as well as iOS platforms, where you can just load in songs and do mastering at the audio quality level emulated from their analog mastering studio here in Southern California. And forgive the sound that's coming through from the walls of other, anyway, and then it also works as a plugin in all your major DAW platforms, and it can be used for both mastering and mixing. So we're going to talk about some different things here. I like to every time I talk to them, because I've worked with them as a musician myself with Lurssen Mastering, and they're brilliant. They've worked with so many of my favorite artists. They did the John Lennon box set that just came out and recently, and tons of things. The Game of Thrones soundtrack, and they're constantly busy working with Eric Clapton and the Foo Fighters, and so there's a lot to learn every time I talk to them, and I've known them for years. But let's talk about the plugin itself and kind of just get into. First, let's talk about the philosophy of the plugin, because basically this is a unique standalone and plugin package, because it's a modeling. It's the first time I've ever seen this, a modeling not just of a EQ or a compressor, but it's the modeling of their entire analog chain. So first of all, why don't you tell us the background of how you got into mastering and then how you developed this chain, Gavin?
Well, this is what it's like working with Dave. I always feel this looming presence behind me looking over my shoulder, which is why we made a plug-in. So, how I got into it in the beginning. I drove from Berklee College of Music with my college degree, one futon mattress, my cassette tapes, one guitar, some clothing, and I drove out to LA. And I got started with a guy named Doug Sachs as a runner in 1991, and worked my way up, stayed in the business, and we broke out from that in, I think, 2004, 2005, somewhere around there. Reuben had come to me just before that. I'll explain that story in a second, but one of the things I learned from Doug, and I found I'll just say this quickly because I think it's relevant to the plugin. Yesterday we were on a panel and we were talking about the chain of events that happens when you go through our process. And when I was trained in the process, a lot of the tape machine alignment was in the sound, so that by the time we got done aligning the tape machine, everything was on tape in those days, in the early 90s, all through the 90s. And then we would work from there. We didn't have that much low end. But we would do a little touch of stuff. We didn't do a lot of processing. It was all done in the tape machine alignment. So we would have options of tube electronics, solid state electronics. We would have options of different tape heads, different tape machines, and we would spend hours and hours and hours. Was that coming from the IK booth?
No.
Next door.
Next door.
And we'd show up at maybe about 10 o'clock to start a session, and by 2 or maybe 3 o'clock, we would start to wonder what we were going to do to process the sound. 4 or 5 hours was spent easily deciding how to play the tape back. And you could play it back in so many different ways, and it would have so much to do with the sound, and we would have regular clients. Back then, in those days, there was a dozen people in the business working. I mean, more than that, but just to exaggerate the point. And we would get used to who we were working with, and we were working with people like the late, great Ed Cherney all the time. His mixes were, top shelf. Al Schmidt would come in regularly, George Massenberg. I mean, the list goes on. And I was a runner picking up sandwiches for these people and being around their work and, seeing how they approached stuff. So they would come in with their reels of tape. We'd we'd do all this, and then at the end of the day, we would do a touch of EQ, a little bit of top end, a little bit of low end, a little bit of compression, whatever it took to make it work within the format, because so much of the work was done beforehand. So if you look at today's version of that same chain of events, and you look at anybody's chain, there's all this stuff that's going on. But a lot of it is the same conceptual way of approaching things. You kind of lift things up and bloom things, and once you get a mix to open up, then you'll do a touch of this, a touch of that. But to the untrained eye, if you just come in at the end and look at what's on the console, you'll see massive amounts of stuff going on. So we broke this down. I've always held this sensibility in my work, and we decided in this plugin to give a starting point, to give that, metaphoric tape machine alignment, the starting point, based on genres of music, based on consistent places people go when they work on particular styles of music. So it gives you first, second gear, third, fourth gear, and then you'll come in at the end with some confidence. If you're not really versed in the field, and do a little touch of work at the end. And if you look at the console, there's a lot of stuff going on, but never to be overdone. Always just kind of to build in some confidence. Gives you a starting point. So I'm kind of talking about the plugin and a little bit about how I started and what I learned, and without getting technical and going into all the gear, because I'm not a gearhead. I'm just kind of talking conceptually how I look at it all and how we came up with that plugin. So stayed in the business. Met Reuben, I think in 2003 maybe. Reuben came in and he's become a star in his own light, and we get in there. We got 2 rooms. We slog away. We work on great albums, a lot of great soundtracks. Dave mentioned some of them. We've had great fortune, great luck. We really are fortunate to be welcome in this community, and we work hard for that respect and try to offer great service. I'm not sure else what to say, but
well, let me just add this. So basically, when I've mastered with Gavin and Reuben, there's a portion of it that is literally the sound of running through their system. It literally, that itself glues it, and then there's the tweaking from there. And what we did as a plugin and as a standalone software that makes it useful to myself and all of you, is that it's a combination of the modeling of the sound of their system. So you have all the chain, which is very important to have the EQ before the compressor, or this particular EQ. All those things have been selected, and he worked with Doug Sachs, the mastering lab and everything. So this is like audiophile, years of experience being, coming to what they have now, and that's why guys like T-Bone Burnett and all these, Rafa from Westworld and all those go to Lurssen Mastering, and myself, except for I don't always have the budget to master everything, and sometimes some tracks I work on or that people work on, it's not even the final, but you kind of want it to, you're playing it to an artist you're working with, or you're playing it to a label, or you're playing it to whoever, and you want it to sound mastered. This is great for that, and it's useful, just to have around as a finalization. But so now you have this philosophy, and that's one the chains and everything. But then you have the presets. So tell us, Reuben, tell us a little bit about the point of the presets and what it means in terms of the chain, the difference in chain, and what it does, how people would use those presets.
Sure. Well, when we set out to design this with IK, we had a couple of things in mind. We had to develop a tool that was very user-friendly, because mastering, let's be honest, people don't really understand. They understand the concept, but they don't understand how to steer the ship all the time, and it can get very confusing, and people kind of get lost in the process. And there's a lot of information about what mastering is, and there's a lot of information that contradicts other information, so people kind of just get lost in it all. And what we wanted to do was create a tool that was intuitive and that gave you a whole lot of insight and informed your decisions as you use it. So as you start using it, it gives you feedback, and then you can work from that place, and then it kind of falls into place just by default if you use it properly. In other words, it almost works as though you're bowling and there's those little things in the sides, like so you don't roll a gutter ball. Now, we had to do that, but at the same time, we didn't want to design anything with any compromises in terms of sound. And we found that working just day in, day out on a whole bunch of different genres on the analog console, that there were certain starting points that started to always come up day to day. And from that starting point, then you can kind of work off that and fine tune and massage things into place to really optimize whatever mix that you have working on at hand. But essentially what the presets are they are go-to starting points to audition as a loose starting point. For instance, we have, I think up there it says jazz, right? So if you look at the chain right here, it starts with a tube equalizer. That's the first thing in the chain, and actually you can see that. That's a 5-band EQ right at the bottom, and you can adjust that. That's the first piece of gear in the signal path in this particular preset. And second to that, right after that in order, is a solid state equalizer. Then comes a tube limiter, which is more of a vintage type of tube limiter. And then you have a solid state de-esser, which is like a high frequency limiter. And you have a solid state compressor after that. And then under the hood on the back end, there is a brick wall limiter that is in a fixed position. And all of these compressors or limiters, all these dynamic processes in series are designed in terms of their gain structure to work as one process. So for instance, if you consider this like a nice sponge to absorb transients, and you can EQ into this dynamic process right before the digital ceiling that we're all up against. Everybody, it doesn't matter if you're working in Pro Tools or any DAW or any mastering house, if you're doing it by yourself in a bedroom, we're all up against the same digital ceiling. So this plugin goes right before that, and you can EQ into it. And the way we like to encourage people to use it is, you see there's an input drive at the beginning. One thing that people often get mixed up on is, how far do I push something? You know, should I just make this should I make this song sound like another song that my artist wants it to sound like? And oftentimes that's the quickest way to bury yourself, because you're not necessarily catering to the mix at hand, you know, and you might lose the mix along the way while doing that. So to prevent people from getting lost, the way we encourage people to use this is, you take the input drive and you lower it all the way. And then you gain it back up until you start feeling like you hear those compressors starting to react to the music, and you push it maybe even a little far beyond that point, and you really get a sense of what that's doing, and then you back it off. And then you fine tune between those places in space until you find a preferred place, and then you touch the EQ if you want, and find a better balance at that place. And you might want to reference some mastered music out there, just in your peripheral vision, to give you some insight in terms of where you are and where you might want to end up leading towards. And then once you do the EQ, you might want to go back and fine-tune the gain on the input drive a little bit, and you work these things off each other until you start fine-tuning and fine-tuning. And then if you want from there, you can export that setting, take it out to the car, put it on your iPhone, fine-tune it in the car, or anywhere you want, any other reference point. If you want to guess and, you know, eliminating the guess and check type of scenario that we're all familiar with as we used to do, making a CD, putting out to the car, seeing how it feels there, going back to the studio, adjusting, going back and forth. This takes all of that out of the way with this immediate car test type of technology that we implemented. So that's kind of a very kind of short version of what this process could look like for the person using it.
Let me add something to that. So one of the things we often do is we combine tube EQ and solid state EQ. And when we get into solid state EQ, we usually use it on the low end. It somehow just feels better in our chain, in our rig. You know, a different person's chain could be a whole different thing. So in our case, we'll try to get, if we're trying to get some punch in some music, which is something that you would do in the olden days on a tape machine when you align it, you know, you'd look for a certain punch with a certain genre or a certain engineer or a certain artist, you know, a certain genre. So if we combine that, we'll put the tube EQ first. So we'll get our signal in there, we'll get some saturation, we'll open it up, we'll really kind of push the tube EQ. We'll put a de-esser on at the end, not because the music needs de-essing, but because we're pushing the tube EQ so hard that we'll kind of clamp down on how hard we're pushing it, so it'll sound bright and open and modern and snappy, but it's not going to take the enamel off your teeth. And then we'll come into the solid state EQ, get that bottom punchy, combine that with the tube saturation, and all of a sudden you got something magical. So we built that in, and that's what, a little more detail on what he's talking about with the chain. you can select those chains for the genre. We kind of got used to how we would approach that type of thing depending on the genre. So we measured that out and built that into the design with IK. And some of the engineers who designed this are floating around here, so it's a cool opportunity to maybe meet some of them too.
So much. Oh,
sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, as Gavin was saying, giving that example between the interrelationship between the EQ and the high frequency limiting, and how those two things together, in combination with everything else that's going on, creates this beautiful whole. Everything that is in that chain is designed to work with everything else. In other words, if you look at that default setting, Dave, would you mind option clicking the push knob?
Which one?
The push knob.
Oh.
Just option click it, or put it back to 0.
Put it 0.
Yeah. So, or maybe we just go back to a default setting. Anyway, if this is default to your starting point, you'll see that there you go. See on the bottom there, that 5-band EQ, it goes 8, 10, 10, 10, 8. That's a little bit like an arc shape. It's a reverse smile face curve. That is designed to work in combination with the natural smile face curve of the compression and dynamic processing happening in the chain. So when you put it all together, you actually end up in a flat place. But it has this dimension and this kind of almost this juxtaposition between all of these processes, and they kind of work together in this push and pull kind of way that creates this bloom in a very musical and natural way. And if you do it properly and you really get this, you fine-tune this into a place that feels optimized for whatever you're working on, you'll be less conscious of the fact that you're working this mix up against a digital ceiling. And as mastering engineers, we're always very conscious of how we're interacting with that digital ceiling. You don't want to be conscious of it. You want to use it as a tool, as something to work up against. I used this analogy yesterday. We were on the Mix with the Masters panel, and I like using this analogy. If you imagine a box, right, and you have a balloon, and you blow up a balloon into a box, you can keep blowing that balloon until it starts taking the shape of the box a little bit. You blow it too much, it completely takes the shape of the box, and then it's the equivalent of something like this. You're pushing up music into the place of where your transients are interacting with that digital ceiling. If you go too far, you end up being conscious of the fact that you are working up against something, and that's just never really musical sounding for anything.
That you're working in the box.
Yeah, case in point. So we want to be very careful to understand and be sensitive to interacting with that digital ceiling, so we're not conscious of it. And it feels like everything's just moving past and open beyond that. There's no confines that you're conscious of. The reality is that there certainly is, but you're just not aware of it. And if we can achieve that, we go for musicality first, that's part of the way we do the best job we can do.
Yeah, a lot of people go for hype and how loud can you make it and how far can you push it into the corner. You're painting yourself into a corner. So everything that we're talking about here is music first. It's not hype first. You can certainly hype anything. Any of these tools can hype anything out there. Anybody can do that. Anybody can out loud anybody else these days. Nobody's got some secret tool that does that. So it's always about the musicality first, about how the music will bloom, and you always set it at the top limit. So, music first and let it fit its own level. And in the streaming services today, that level thing is no longer an issue. The more you compress it, the worse it sounds, because they level it out once they get it anyway. So it's a perfect product for that, where it's really music first. It's going to make the stuff bloom more than a lot of people out there that are hyping everything,
Yeah, one of the things that I like about most IK products is that they have a duality where in a certain way they're useful for beginners, and at the same time they're useful for the top pros. And a product like this is interesting because IK has T-racks where each individual compressor and EQ is totally tweakable, and if you know what you're doing, you can set up your own chain, and you can do all that, and of course you do that for the mix, and I do. But having a Lurssen mastering console where it's sort of all in one, and you don't have as much access to each parameter, although you have important ones, but you have their knowledge and their chains and setups, and even though there's different styles as the presets, by the way, you can ignore that if you're doing, like, let's say if I'm doing a rock record and I just want the chain that's in the EDM, and it's not even EDM, you can use it that way. It's a tip that I've gotten from these guys. It's like, okay, it's all there to just make it fast and easy. So if you're a pro, even if you're going to Lurssen Mastering or another mastering house, you can actually, although why would you go to another mastering house, right? No, I'm just kidding. No, even if you're going to the mastering house with your album, you can actually run it through there first. Like one of the things I used to do before this existed is I would bug the heck out of them, and I would be like, oh, could you just change this? Or I didn't know it was going to be this loud. I'm going to go back to my mix and take my mix bus and do less compression and all that stuff. And that's a big thing, like Gavin was saying, where it's like you don't want to overcook it and then give it to them, and there's not much they can do with it. The dynamics are already squashed, whatever. So having this is a quick way to just hear what it would sound like if it went to the mastering house, more or less, and you go, oh, okay, I'm going to change my mix. And it just increases your chances of spending less time mastering because you kind of have an idea, and then they can take it from there. So, and then of course, if you're a beginner or you're a semi-pro or you're just on a budget, it's great. And there's a lot of records where I just don't have the budget to go to them, and I use the Lurssen Mastering Console to kind of, get the sound that I want, and sound like I did go to this mastering house. So that's the fun of some of these products. It's like, well, you can get a set of iLoud MTMs, which they also have at the studio, right? And you can, they have a lot of different speakers to listen to.
We have both the smalls and the bigs now.
Right. And so it's the same kind of real-world testing that they would have at the studio, and you have a recreation of their entire rig, which you can see where is it? Where's that? Yeah, there. That's their rig. That's what it looks like at their studio. So anyway, that's Gavin Lurssen and Reuben Cohen talking about Lurssen Mastering Console. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you.
And it's a great thing to have if you're on the road, and those iLouds I've found, when you get out, if you want to check something, like I'm at NAMM right now, if somebody needs something in an emergency, I can either work or I can maybe give some feedback on a mix, anything. If somebody calls me, go to my laptop, plug in some of the iLouds in the hotel room, and it's amazing what it reveals, actually. So we heavily endorse those and encourage people to check those out, too.
Thank you very much.
Yep. Thanks.
Coming up at noon, we will be talking about the brand new Sunset Sound Studio Reverb with Ross Hogarth and Joe Ciccarelli. So stop by and check that out.